Traveling alone or with friends to an unfamiliar place means constantly meeting people you have no real way of vetting. A friendly stranger at a bar, someone who offers to show you around, a match on a dating app in a city you've never been to before. Most of the time, that trust works out fine. Tonight's 3 stories are about the times it didn't. Tonight, an 18-year-old on a graduation trip to Aruba who left a bar with a young local man and whose disappearance triggered an 18-year search that only ended with a confession few people ever expected. An American woman traveling alone in Istanbul, photographing the city, who was quietly followed and befriended by a man determined not to let her leave. And a British backpacker on a Tinder date in New Zealand, on what should have been an ordinary night out on her 22nd birthday. Every detail in this video is documented. Court records, police statements, and news reporting from the time each case broke. None of it is exaggerated for effect. What connects these 3 stories is a specific, uncomfortable truth about travel. The openness that makes meeting new people abroad so appealing is the exact same openness that, for these 3 women, turned out to be a risk they had no real way of seeing coming. Let's get into it. Story 1. The beach in Aruba. In May of 2005, 18-year-old Natalie Holloway traveled to Aruba with a group of graduating classmates from Mountain Brook High School in Alabama, celebrating the end of high school with a week at an all-inclusive resort. It was the kind of trip taken by thousands of American high school graduates every year. A well-worn tradition of sun, beaches, and a final week together before everyone scattered to different colleges. On the night of May 30th, her last night on the island before her flight home, Holloway went out with friends to a local bar where she met a 17-year-old Dutch national named Joran van der Sloot, along with 2 brothers, Deepak and Satish Kelpo. Surveillance footage and witness accounts placed Holloway leaving the bar with 3 young men in the early morning hours of May 30th. She was never seen again. The disappearance triggered one of the largest and most publicized missing persons searches in modern history, drawing intense, sustained American media coverage for months. Van der Sloot and the Kalpo brothers were arrested and questioned multiple times over the following 2 years, but Aruban authorities repeatedly released them, citing insufficient evidence to formally charge anyone. Van der Sloot offered a series of shifting, inconsistent accounts over the years that followed, at different points claiming he'd left Holloway alive on the beach, that she'd fallen and struck her head on a rock, or that his own father, a prominent Aruban judge who died in 2010, had helped him hide her body. None of these accounts led to a conviction or to the discovery of her remains. The case took a bizarre turn in 2010 when Van der Sloot contacted an attorney representing Holloway's mother Beth and offered to reveal the location of her daughter's remains in exchange for $250,000. An initial payment of $25,000 to start, with the remaining balance due once the remains were confirmed. He took the attorney to a specific site in Aruba after receiving the first payment, then later admitted in an email that the information he'd provided was worthless. That same year, while the extortion scheme against the Holloway family was still unresolved, van der Sloot murdered a 21-year-old Peruvian woman named Stephanie Flores in a Lima hotel room on the 5-year anniversary of Holloway's disappearance, after she discovered details connecting him to the Holloway case on his laptop. He was convicted of that murder in Peru and sentenced to 28 years in prison. For the next 13 years, the Holloway case remained legally unresolved. Van der Sloot, the widely presumed but never formally charged suspect, Natalie's family left without a body, a conviction, or any official confirmation of what had actually happened that night. Then, in 2023, American prosecutors indicted van der Sloot on federal charges of extortion and wire fraud connected to the 2010 scheme against Beth Holloway. As part of a negotiated plea agreement, one Beth Holloway herself was consulted on and ultimately supported. Van der Sloot agreed to finally tell the truth about what had happened to Natalie in exchange for his guilty plea to the extortion charges. In October of 2023, in a formal interview with prosecutors, van der Sloot confessed in graphic detail. He said Holloway had rejected his sexual advances on the beach that night, that he'd become enraged, grabbed a cinder block and struck her in the head with it, killing her. He described dragging her body into the ocean and pushing it out into the water alone. After two friends who had been present earlier that night had already gone home, Beth Holloway, present in court to hear the confession, told reporters afterward that she was finally satisfied knowing what had happened, that he had acted alone, and that he had disposed of her daughter's remains alone as well. Van der Sloot was sentenced to 20 years in the US federal case and returned to Peru to continue serving his sentence for the Flores murder. Aruban authorities, upon hearing the confession, indicated the Holloway case technically remains an open investigation on the island, though it remains unclear whether any additional charges will ever be filed there, given how many years had already passed. What makes this case so singular is the sheer length of the wait. 18 years between Natalie Holloway's disappearance and her family finally hearing from the man responsible exactly what had happened to her. For nearly 2 decades, Van der Sloot remained free to travel, to attempt to extort the very family he devastated, and, in the process, to murder a second young woman before any consequence ever caught up with him for the first. The confession itself, once it finally came, arrived through an unusual and carefully negotiated process. FBI officials involved in the case later explained that securing it required years of quiet groundwork, compiling and cross-referencing every prior statement van der Sloot had ever given, however contradictory, in the hope that a formal plea agreement might eventually create the right conditions for the truth to surface. Beth Holloway herself was consulted extensively by investigators and prosecutors in the months leading up to the deal, given direct input into how the negotiation would proceed, in recognition of just how long she had already waited for any real answer. When the confession was finally read into the court record in October of 2023, Judge Anna Manasco addressed van der Sloot directly, noting that he had now brutally murdered 2 separate young women, years apart, each of whom had refused his sexual advances. A detail that placed Natalie Holloway's death within a documented pattern, rather than an isolated, unexplainable tragedy. Story 2. the photographer. In January of 2013, 33-year-old Sarai Sierra, a stay-at-home mother of two from Staten Island, New York, traveled alone to Istanbul, Turkey, on her very first trip outside the United States. Friends described her as someone who had only recently discovered a genuine passion for photography and who had spent months carefully planning the trip as a way to finally pursue that hobby seriously, choosing Istanbul specifically for its dramatic architecture and centuries of layered history. She'd recently taken up photography as a hobby and had planned the 9-day trip specifically to build a portfolio documenting the city's architecture and street life. Throughout the trip, she stayed in close, near daily contact with her husband and family back home, texting and video calling regularly to share what she'd seen and where she was headed next. On January 21st, the day before she was scheduled to fly home, Sierra went silent. Her family, accustomed to her constant updates, grew alarmed within hours and reported her missing almost immediately. When they arrived in Istanbul to help search for her, investigators discovered she had left her passport, clothing, phone chargers, and medical cards behind in her room at a hostel in the Beyoğlu district. She had gone out that day, intending to return. Surveillance footage recovered during the search showed Sierra at a food court and walking along a city street on the day she disappeared. And investigators noted she appeared to be followed in some of the footage. After a search lasting nearly 2 weeks, her body was discovered on February 2nd near the ruins of Istanbul's ancient Byzantine-era city walls, close to the Sea of Marmara, a location not far from some of the city's most visited tourist sites, but itself an isolated, little-traveled stretch avoided by most passers-by. She had been killed by a violent blow to the head. Investigators noted her jewelry, including her bracelet, ring, earrings, and watch, remained on her body, and there was no sign of sexual assault, complicating early theories about a motive. In the days that followed, wild and often baseless speculation filled both American and Turkish media. Tabloid theories ranged from claims she'd been a foreign intelligence operative to elaborate espionage conspiracies involving Russia, none of which held up to any scrutiny. What investigators eventually established was far less exotic and far more disturbing in its ordinariness. Turkish police identified and arrested a local man, Ziya Tashalu, known locally by the nickname La Zia, who had reportedly connected with Sierra during her trip, and according to the eventual case against him, had followed her, killed her with a rock during what he initially described as a struggle, and left her body among the ancient city walls, hoping the isolated, foul-smelling location would keep it from being discovered. At trial in 2014, Tashalu admitted to killing Sierra, though he disputed the exact circumstances, claiming he had only attempted to kiss her rather than sexually assault her, and that he had been under the influence of drugs at the time of the killing. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, along with additional years added for related charges of assault and theft. What makes Sarai Sierra's case linger even more than a decade later is how deliberately ordinary her trip had been right up until its final hours. She wasn't reckless. She kept her family constantly updated on her whereabouts, stayed in a reputable hostel, and spent her days doing exactly what she traveled to Istanbul to do: photographing a beautiful, historic city that by any reasonable measure, and by its own genuinely low rates of violent crime, was not a place she had any particular reason to fear. Her case became, for a period, a flashpoint in a broader and often uncomfortable public debate about whether women should travel alone at all. A debate her own family, and many observers at the time, argued missed the point entirely, since the danger she encountered wasn't a matter of geography, but of one specific person who chose to follow her. An American writer living in Istanbul at the time, who followed the case closely as it unfolded, later described the strange dual reaction the murder produced locally: genuine, widespread grief among Istanbul residents, who had come to refer to Sierra affectionately by her last name alone, as though she'd become a kind of adopted daughter of the city, alongside frustration at the wave of international commentary suggesting the murder somehow reflected badly on Turkey or Istanbul as a whole. That writer pointed out that Istanbul, a metropolis of more than 13 million people, actually maintains a murder rate lower than New York City's, a statistic that complicated the simpler, more sensational narrative many outlets outside Turkey were quick to run with in the days after Sierra's body was found. Story 3. The birthday Grace Millane was a 21-year-old British university graduate from Essex, England, backpacking through South America and then New Zealand on a gap year after finishing her degree in advertising and marketing. She'd left England chasing the same well-worn dream so many young graduates pursue before settling into a career. Months of freedom, new places, new friends, and enough photos to fill an entire album before real life properly began. Her parents later described her as constantly in touch throughout her travels, sending them a steady stream of photos and updates from every stop along the way. On November 30th, 2018, while staying in Auckland, Millane matched with a 26-year-old local man named Jesse Shane Kempson on the dating app Tinder. The two arranged to meet the following evening, December 1st, for a date. Surveillance cameras captured the two of them together that night around the city center, including footage inside Sky City, before they were last seen together at 9:41 p.m. entering the City Life Hotel on Queen Street, where Kempson was staying. December 2nd was Grace Millane's 22nd birthday. Her parents sent her their usual birthday messages that day. She never responded. The first time in the entire trip, she had gone silent. Growing concerned over the following days, they reported her missing on December 5th. Police in Auckland initially found insufficient evidence to determine what had happened, but within days concluded she was no longer alive, and by December 8th were treating the case formally as a homicide investigation. Investigators quickly identified Kempson, a man with an undisclosed history of violence against women that would only fully come to light later, as a central suspect. Surveillance footage recovered during the investigation showed him at a supermarket purchasing a large suitcase in the days after Millane's disappearance. Her body was ultimately discovered on December 9th, buried in the Waitakere Ranges, a forested area west of Auckland. At trial, Kempson claimed Millane had died accidentally during consensual rough sex that he said had gone wrong, telling the court he had choked her during the encounter without any intention of killing her. Prosecutors presented a starkly different account, arguing the evidence showed Millane had been strangled to death in his hotel room. Her body then transported and buried in a remote location specifically chosen to delay discovery. Actions inconsistent with any claim of an accidental death. In November of 2019, a jury found Kempson guilty of murder, and in February of 2020, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 17 years before parole eligibility. The case sent shockwaves through New Zealand, a country that markets itself internationally and generally regards itself as an unusually safe destination for solo and backpacker travel. Then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern issued a tearful, direct public apology to the Millane family after Grace's body was found, saying the country had failed to keep her safe. What emerged in the years following Kempson's murder conviction made the case even more disturbing. A court order had suppressed his name from public reporting during the initial trial, an unusual step that went unexplained at the time. That suppression was finally lifted in December of 2020, once 2 additional, entirely separate criminal cases against him had concluded. A violent knife assault against a former girlfriend in 2017, during which he chased her through their home, holding a knife to her throat, and the rape of a different young British tourist he had also met through Tinder, just months before he murdered Millane. Both women had come forward only after recognizing details connecting Kempson to the widely publicized Millane case, with one testifying that seeing a blurred police photo of the suspect had triggered an immediate gut-level certainty about who he was. Kempson received an additional 11 years for these combined offenses, to be served concurrently with his murder sentence, meaning a documented pattern of escalating violence against women he'd met the exact same way, through a dating app, in the exact same city, had gone unpunished and unreported until it ended in Grace Millane's death. One of the 2 women who came forward had actually dated Kempson before Millane ever arrived in New Zealand, matching with him on Tinder in October of 2018, just weeks before he murdered Millane. She later told a court that Kempson had chased her through their shared home with a knife, held it to her throat, and that something inside him seemed to simply snap in the moments. When she saw a blurred image of Millane's suspected killer circulating in the news weeks later, she said she felt an immediate, overwhelming certainty about his identity, describing the moment her entire world came crashing down around her a second time. A separate young British tourist who had also matched with Kempson on Tinder just months before Millane's murder, later testified that she went rigid and simply let the assault happen so she could get through the encounter and go home safely. Testimony that, once finally made public, painted a portrait of a man whose violence toward the women he met through the same app had been escalating for years before anyone outside his immediate victims had any idea. 3 tourists, 3 different countries, decades and continents apart, and 3 completely different circumstances. A graduation trip that ended with an 18-year wait for the truth. A solo photography trip cut short by a man who followed a stranger through the streets of an unfamiliar city. And a Tinder date that turned out to be with a man whose documented history of violence had never caught up with him until it was too late for the young woman he'd just met. What connects all 3 of these stories is a specific, uncomfortable truth about travel that's easy to forget in the moment. Meeting new people is, for most travelers, the entire point of going somewhere unfamiliar in the first place. A chance encounter at a bar, a friendly local eager to show you around, a match on an app in a city you've never visited before. For the overwhelming majority of travelers, that openness is exactly what makes a trip memorable, in all the right ways. For Natalie Holloway, Sarai Sierra, and Grace Millane, it was the same openness that put them, unknowingly, in a room or on a beach with someone who had already shown or would go on to show a documented pattern of violence. It's worth sitting to with how long it took for the truth to fully surface in each of these cases. Natalie Holloway's family waited 18 years for a confession. Sarai Sierra's killer was identified and convicted within about a year and a half, relatively swift by comparison, though the speculation and misinformation that filled the gap in between caused its own separate damage to her memory. And Grace Millane's killer had already assaulted 2 other women who met him the exact same way she had. Warnings that existed but went unreported until his identity was finally made public, well over a year after her murder. In each case, the people closest to these women were left for a period of time that ranged from months to nearly 2 decades, without the one thing they needed most: a clear, honest answer about what had actually happened to someone they loved. There's a specific detail worth sitting with across all 3 of these stories. In each one, the danger wasn't a total stranger lurking in the shadows. It was someone the victim had, in some limited but real sense, chosen to trust. A young man met at a bar, a local who struck up a friendly conversation on the street, a match on a dating app specifically designed to connect strangers who'd never otherwise cross paths. None of these women ignored an obvious red flag or wandered somewhere they had been explicitly warned to avoid. They did exactly what millions of travelers do every single day, extending the same ordinary, reasonable trust that makes travel worth doing in the first place. And for these 3 women, on these 3 specific nights, that trust turned out to be the single most consequential decision of their lives. If this video got under your skin, hit subscribe. New true stories every week. And let me know in the comments which one of these 3 stories disturbed you the most. See you in the next one.